welcome. My name is Frank Castillo. I'd like to welcome you to today's session entitled The Remote Office, Regulatory and Ethical Considerations. Now, before we begin our session today, let's just cover some of the learning objectives associated with our course. We'll recall which branch of ethics is closely aligned with regulatory guidance in organizations. We'll also identify prevailing global trends in business ethics. We'll recall which regulatory standards apply to tax practitioners concerning confidential client records. We'll identify which states have adopted privacy laws for business entities. And lastly, we'll recall business best practices in connection with remote workers. A whole lot to get to today, so let's get started. Thanks again for being with us. We'll start our session by actually talking a little bit about what I won't be covering in this ethics course. And that has to do with some of these different branches of ethics that I'm sure are interesting in their own regard, but as it applies to practitioners trying to decide what's right and what's wrong in their everyday work, I don't think they necessarily apply. So I won't be talking about Kantianism or divine command theory and utilitarianism and deontology and consequentialism. For goodness sake, I can't even pronounce these things, so forgive me if I've mispronounced, but I think once again, we really want to simply focus on that body of ethics that applies to our everyday work and how best to arrive at ethical decisions accordingly. Now, three branches of ethics that I do want to specifically mention, and they do have a little bit of overlap to what we want to focus on, which is applied ethics, but meta-ethics really focuses on the meaning of ethical terms. So, for instance, what is goodness, and on questions of how ethical knowledge is obtained, rather than on the more applied question of what should I do in a particular situation. Now, meta-ethics is concerned with the nature of ethical properties and statements and attitudes and judgments, and it looks for questions on what is true and what is false. So now we're starting to get from some of these very distant ethical philosophies closer towards an applied ethics that we encounter on an everyday basis. Normative ethics, in contrast, is the study of ethical acts. So it focuses explicitly on questions having to do with what people ought to do and on how people should decide what the correct or moral actions are to take. But primarily, we're going to focus on applied ethics, which is concerned with how people can achieve moral outcomes in specific situations. So it's concerned with the particular philosophical examination of complex issues that involve moral judgments. A couple of applied areas in this regard are bioethics, environmental ethics, developmental ethics, and business corporate ethics, which again is a derivative of applied ethics. Well, we have this foundation in applied ethics, and the question is, how does that then turn into ethical standards that we encounter on an everyday basis? Well, what we find is in the education world that during the 70s and during the 80s, we had a couple of important publications that helped shape our modern accounting environment that we operate in. Professor Loeb, during the 80s, had written a seminal paper on what the goals of accounting ethics and ethics education should be. And his publication was Teaching Students Accounting Ethics, Some Crucial Issues. And this was issued in 1988. And this was adapted from suggestions of goals from Professor Callahan, who had wrote the goals and teaching of ethics back in the early 1980s. And the goals that they incorporated into their work are the foundations for the standards that we encounter today. So some of the goals are to relate accounting education to moral issues, to also recognize accounting issues that have ethical implications, develop a sense of moral obligation or responsibility, develop the abilities needed to deal with ethical conflicts or dilemmas, to learn to deal with the uncertainties of the accounting profession, set the stage for a change in ethical behavior, and also to appreciate and understand the history and composition of all aspects of accounting ethics in their relationship to the general field of ethics. So what are the known need for ethics? Well, the nature of the work carried out by accountants and auditors requires a high level of ethics. Shareholders and potential shareholders and other users of financial statements rely heavily on the yearly financial statements of a company, as they can use this information to make an informed decision about investments. They rely on the opinion of accountants who prepared those statements, as well as auditors who verified it, to present what we typically know as a true and fair view of the company's financials. Now, knowledge of ethics can help accountants and auditors to overcome any ethical dilemmas and allow for the right choice to be made, although it may not benefit the company necessarily, but it will benefit those in the public who rely on the accountant and auditor reports. Particularly as it relates to audits, particularly as it relates to financial statements, we need to be sure that we have accurate financial reporting, compliant tax returns, that valuations are rooted in truth and competency, that we have accuracy in information needed to decide on mergers and acquisitions, and also to determine creditworthiness. One thing that we should understand is that ethics is not a static situation. Our marketplace, our world is constantly evolving, and one such area that we find increased attention on has to do with ESG, or environmental, social, and governance. And this is information that is being demanded more and more by various stakeholders associated with the company's financials. Questions that we need to ask are, how will ethics impact these evolving requirements? Because currently the lack of consistency in standards is creating issue in the marketplace, and again, increasing demand from stakeholders is front and center. And in fact, over the first few months of 2021, we witnessed some major milestones in investor and regulators' efforts to get public companies to provide additional information to shareholders regarding environmental, social, and governance issues. And the SEC understands that this is problematic, that the lack of standards is creating tension in the marketplace. So in March, the SEC published a request for public comments about ESG disclosures. And the move is followed, I should say that the move followed the launch of an enforcement division task force to uncover flawed ESG-related disclosures that violate its regulations. Additionally, shareholders are becoming more assertive in getting companies to lessen their reliance on fossil fuels. So we have a lot of outward pressure from shareholders to demand environmental, social, and governance information. And as a result of that, we're seeing an evolution in standards and the ethics associated with some of the reporting requirements. Let's touch for a moment on stakeholders. Various stakeholders clearly are in play when we talk about ethics, when we talk about a corporation's financial statements. Obviously, investors and shareholders, we have employees, customers, suppliers, lenders, government agencies, management, and the general public. And for a moment now, let's take a look at the ways that some of these initiatives, some of the organizations that we see, how do they pronounce their ethical values to the marketplace? Well, we have various ways that ethics takes place in our everyday world. We have compliance certificates. So this is where an organization requires contractors, agents, or suppliers to agree with a company's stated standards. Purchase orders and letters of credit. You may have organizations which require suppliers to agree with the company's policy. Special documents are written codes of conduct that summarizes company guidelines, principles, or standards. And also, organizations may issue circulated letters which are addressed to shareholders stating their company policies on specific issues.